My grandfather was at one stage the most sought after terrorist in England because he was leading the war against England for Ireland's independence. And so it was people would subsequently wonder whether his terrorist antics, whether that had any impact on my outlook on business.
From the shadows of political conflict to the front lines of global sport, Michael Payne became one of the most influential figures in the Olympic movement, the architect behind modern sports marketing, and a key force keeping the games alive through global turmoil.
When I joined, the Olympic Games was unlikely to survive because it had no funding. It was caught up in the political Cold Wars. They were a pawn between the superpowers.
I lived in Greece for a couple of years in Athens, and a lot of white elephants after 2004.
I remember at the time battling with the Greeks to say, Greece doesn't play baseball, so we don't need a baseball stadium. But you would have one or other politician, for whatever particular reason he may have in mind, would insist on building a baseball stadium.
Another country that is usually under the magnifying glass is the United States. How do you think that the LA 28 will be? Can they deliver to the expectation?
The president of the country, Donald Trump, is...
Michael Payne, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Great to be back with you.
It is great to have you back. As you said, you were on episode 29, and now we are on 200 something. So great to have you back, and a lot have happened since. Most recently, you just launched another book called Fast Tracks and Dark Deals. So how come you felt that you wanted to write this book?
I was doing some research, and I realized that nobody had really written the history of sports marketing, particularly how over the last 50 years, the industry had evolved from the mid-late 70s to where it is today. And equally, there'd been no biographies of the key founders like Horst Dassler, Mark McCormack. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to write that history? And then I realized that I worked for all of these, titans who created the industry, or I'd negotiated against them. And I thought, well, maybe it would be even more fun if we could make it sort of personal, somewhat of an autobiography, and actually take the reader into the room of the negotiations rather than being a passive observer. And so that's where we've ended up.
Fantastic.
A rather racy story.
Definitely. And it's a great blend of an autobiography and the history of sports as well, because you're getting some personal anecdotes in there as well on how you got into the industry. And so it's also kind of the history of your life as well as the history of sports and sports marketing.
Yes, I mean, I thought it was sort of probably important to sort of explain where I had come from. The book opens with the fact that my grandfather was at one stage the most sought after terrorist in England because he was leading, if you want, the war against England for Ireland's independence as the chief of staff of Michael Collins. And so it was sort of people would subsequently wonder whether his terrorist antics, I mean, as he won the war, would no longer be viewed as a terrorist, as he was a freedom fighter, whether that had any impact on my outlook on business.
Yeah. And also, you early in the book, you said that you spent the last 50 years at the forefront of the sports business, watching it grow from chaotic amateurism into a multi-billion-dollar industry. So in the beginning, for example, IOC had was like one member and not one person working there, and not close to what it is today. And you have been in that growth of IOC and sports marketing. So how's it been like from 50 years ago up until now?
I think that was what was potentially fascinating for people to understand, the evolution of an industry. The fact that I was very privileged to be there at the very beginning. One of the very first negotiations at the agency I was working for, West Nally, when they were developing the marketing strategy for FIFA, FIFA had a total number of employees of 4. you look at the billions of dollars today that FIFA, the IOC, Formula One are generating. It's a far cry from how it all started out 50 years ago. And that's why I thought it would be a fun story to tell. And being able to take a whole industry and document it from the beginning, and the hit and miss, the mistakes, the successes, the characters behind the early development of the industry of what is now a very, very structured industry with thousands of universities teaching master's courses in sports management. It didn't used to be like that.
For sure. And I don't want to spoil, the book, but I want to hit on some points that you bring up. So one of them, you got into the industry when you were a skier, and then basically, learning the game behind the game. So how did you get into the world of sports marketing in the first place?
Um, well, as you say, I was a skier. Maybe not a very good one, because I kept either finding myself in hospital recovering from injuries for downhill, or I then turned to freestyle skiing, or what at the time was known as hot dogging, acrobatic skiing. Um, and to stay on the ski circuit, I had to find sponsors, personal sponsors, um, because there was no national team; it was all professional. And I suppose I was a lot better at finding sponsors than I was at winning any of the competitions. So I sort of decided that maybe I should make a little career change. Um, at the time, the sports marketing industry in the mid 70s was just beginning. And so it was, if you want, fortunate of being there at the beginning in the right place, um, and learning the trade, from the agencies that were sort of set up at the beginning to help develop and build the business.
Yeah. I mean, you describe yourself as a failed ski racer turned professional freestyle skier, and then I guess turn into marketeer. And for those who didn't listen to the first episode with you, I mean, you're the first ever marketing and broadcasting rights director for the IOC, being called father of Olympic branding, creator of the top program, architect of modern sports marketing. So a lot that you have achieved in these 50 years with not really a huge educational background, and to learning from, like as you said, like taking charge of your own destiny in the beginning, that you had to find your own sponsors. So I think that tells a good story of that. Every journey is different, and yours definitely wasn't. Definitely was unique.
It what certainly wouldn't be viewed as the textbook classic. I didn't go to university. I would say probably not easy to break into the industry today if you didn't have your university and your master's degrees. Um, but it's like many industries. If you're obviously lucky to be there at the beginning, then you have to make your own luck. Um, but it was a wild west in building it all up. Um, the IOC was a very small outfit when I joined, and there wasn't a lot of optimism for the future, because they felt that the Olympic Games was unlikely to survive because it had no funding. It was caught up in the political Cold Wars. Um, and so you learned as you went along. You had a number of visionary, people, in particular on the Olympic front, people like Dick Pound, who was a brilliant, Canadian lawyer, who was very much Samaranch's sort of go-to fixer, and for many people, was described as the greatest president the IOC never had. So you had, some great people who mentored you. Later on with Bernie Ecclestone, also somebody who I think didn't go to university, left school at 12 or 13, but saw the opportunity and rolled up the sleeves and made it happen.
Yeah. So you mentioned Bernie Ecclestone and also Thomas. Him and Thomas Bach wrote the foreword for your book. That's two powerhouses in the sports industry. So what have you learned from these two gentlemen?
Well, Thomas Bach and I both worked for Horst Dassler, and Horst Dassler truly was one of the great fathers of the industry. Horst Dassler, the son of the founder of Adidas, and he sort of created the vision and the agency structure first with Westnally, then with ISL, that developed the global marketing programs, the packages, the concept of exclusivity. And I sort of try to profile him in the book as I profile many of the other sort of original great leaders. With Bernie, I mean, I think he was probably by far the best negotiator from a commercial perspective that I met. A absolute genius in terms of how he would conduct negotiations. And so whether Bernie was a sort of a commercial negotiator, Samaranch was probably by far the best political negotiator I met. And you know, the opportunity to work very closely with these leaders, particularly initially at a young age, you know, was a masterclass in itself. You know, beyond probably anything that a university could teach you in practicalities. I mean, whether it was Samaranch and how do you bring the world together? How effectively did he double cross North Korea into then getting China and the Soviet Union to sort of sign up and come to the Olympic Games in Seoul? A lot of the sort of the stories I tell in the book, and there are then interesting business insights which could apply to, you know, any negotiation, whether it's related to sport or not. There are a lot of you know, great lessons on, particularly when you're dealing with very complex, very big, very political deals and issues. Sometimes you wish that, you know, politicians would spend a little bit more time understanding the process and dynamic, as opposed to sort of wading in feet first and then wondering why they don't always get a result.
Sports and politics are always discussed as if they should go together or not, if they should be separated. And I think that it's pretty clear that, I mean, they can't be 100% separated. So what is your view on how much politics impact sports and vice versa?
It's a very complicated issue. You can't bring the world together without there being a strong sort of political dynamic. When I joined the IOC, the Olympics were caught up in the Cold War. They were a pawn between the superpowers, and you know, whether it was the Soviet Union or the US calling for boycotts, and it very nearly, you know, broke, you know, the Olympic and sports world. Yeah, Samaranch proactively engaged with the politicians to say, look, understand what we're trying to achieve here. There's probably more to be gained by bringing the world together than keeping us apart. And he successfully sold that narrative into the political leaders, which, you know, was using the power of sport as a political tool to build its independence. And probably for the better part of 30 years, we had a relatively peace, calm period. Only in the last few years have we seen politicians again starting to wade in and calling for one or other nation to be banned. Whether it's obviously, you know, the issues with Russia and Ukraine, more recently with Israel and Indonesia, and I think one of the biggest challenges, particularly facing the new president, Kirsty Coventry, is the increasing political weaponization of sport. And that's only going to get more complicated. Sport at times is an easy target. For a politician to stand on his soapbox, he's guaranteed to then get great media coverage and probably is not going to upset the fan base or the constituent base because he's there defending or whatever. So that's going to be complicated, and how sport maintains its balance between it has to work within the political system, but equally cannot allow itself to be held hostage to and in more and more politics becoming extreme, whether it's left, whether it's right, sports becoming a target in that crossfire.
Yeah. And you mentioned Russia. There's been Olympic Games in Russia, in China. There are more mega events in the Middle East, and these are always discussed as we're talking now, and if they are used for political purposes. You have described Olympics as a rebranding campaign for a nation. So and then you go into sports washing. So where do we draw the line between a country trying to do better and sports washing?
Well, the media, certainly the Anglo-Saxon media, dial up the image that sports washing is bad and that some countries shouldn't use sport to evolve or change their image. But I'm sorry, I mean, the London Olympics was used as a major platform to evolve the image of Britain. The Lillehammer Games in Norway was also a major branding exercise for Norway in terms of introducing new technologies and new industries. So I think one should be very cautious at, in particular, just taking an Anglo-Saxon view, which is only one small element of humanity, and judging. Now, take China. When the Olympic Games went to China in 2008, there were a lot of expectations that this would fundamentally change, if you want, China's political human rights system and record. I've been going to China for 40 years, and I would say that the Beijing Olympic Games did fundamentally change China. Did it meet the expectations of what some in the West would have had on human rights levels? Probably not. Were those expectations realistic that a sports event was going to change the complete ecos or the political system of a country? Probably not. If you look to the Middle East now, there's no question that they are beginning to discover sport. And, there's a lot of criticism of saying, well, should Saudi be allowed to host major events? If you actually look at what the Saudi political leadership is wanting to achieve, but most of their sports strategy, and I park the World Cup, which is slightly apart, it's actually to build a stronger sports program within Saudi for the nation, because it is a nation that doesn't have, the Saudi people don't have a long history of practicing sport. They are not per se the healthiest nation on the planet. And the Saudi leadership are running some very impressive programs purely focused on getting the Saudi population to become more active. And that, I'm sorry, I think that is a very noble, very legitimate, perhaps is a better word, a legitimate strategy. Um, so, I mean, sport, hosting of events, when Korea was awarded the 88 Olympic Games, and I was sent to live in Korea to put the whole marketing strategy together, a lot of people said, how is this possible? A nation that's still at war, somewhat of a military dictatorship, um, and yet the games were transformative to the nation. From a political standpoint, the games were so important that the government and the military leaders, for the first time, held democratic elections 2 years before the games, because they realized that if they didn't, everything could potentially unravel. So it's the whole issue of sports washing. I don't think you can suddenly pigeonhole one country or another, because depending on how you want to describe the rebranding of a host, every single nation who's hosting a major event is wanting to use it to evolve their brand, to create a new sort of trade opportunities. Um, arguably, China and Saudi are learning from what Europe and the US were doing a decade previously.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, there can be noble reasons behind, but I think if we take Saudi, for example, you have the LGBTQ community that's illegal there. So if you're having an athlete, let's say, or someone else, they don't might not feel safe traveling to Saudi because of their either religious belief or sexual orientation and so forth.
I think that any federation taking their event there would have watertight undertaking and guarantees relative to the protection of everybody, the athletes and everybody going. But I think also if you look at the pace of change, and there is no question that sport is a catalyst for driving change. Can you sort of change a cultural issue overnight? No. Over a decade or two? Absolutely. I mean, I look and I talk about also in the book a little bit sort of from the historical standpoint. Um, you know, Jesse Owens, the legend from the 1936 Berlin Nazi Olympic Games. He was actually received by Hitler. When he went home to America, he was not received by the White House and wasn't even allowed to travel on a bus because of Negro policies at the time, which, if you would look at today, you would say is shocking. So I think one has to be realistic at the pace of change. Saudi Arabia, until fairly recently, has never had a female athlete. It wasn't in the culture of the country to have female athletes. Who is the IOC member for Saudi Arabia today? A woman. That's inconceivable a decade ago. So it takes time. It's not going to evolve necessarily as quickly as one or other activist would like. But equally, sport does put a country or a culture under the magnifying glass. And, it's the media commentary and perspective goes on to force change.
And another country that is usually under the magnifying glass is the United States. They are a big power, obviously, and they are hosting the games in 2028 upcoming. They have already had the games in 32 and 84. Obviously, you were not involved in the 32 games, but in the 84, you were. So, in comparison to the two previous ones, how do you think that the LA 28 will be, and can they, over deliver from what or deliver to the expectation?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. The United States doesn't just have the 28 Olympic Games; it's also got the 26 World Cup. And the president of the country, Donald Trump, is very active and outspoken. Um, I think he will do whatever it takes to ensure both of those events are incredibly successful. He's taking a personal interest. He's empowering leadership within the White House and government to get things fixed and solved. And to be honest, if you're the head of FIFA or the head of the IOC, to have that level of focus and access is good news. I wish we'd had that level of focus and access for the 96 games in Atlanta, where the White House and Washington wasn't that engaged. And as a result, we ran into very challenging problems to live in the games. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the politics of a given leader, having the power of government to help you deliver what it is the world's most complex event is helpful. And they know there is tremendous value of being on the world stage. And, you know, you go back to 84, it did wonders for Reagan's ratings. Now, the countdown to those games or to the World Cup, where you have, I'm trying to think what the diplomatic term would be, should we say, a volatile foreign policy, isn't going to make things plain sailing. So, how you, to the very first discussion point we had about mixing of politics and sport, how you keep the politics out of that debate when it's going to be very easy for one or other politician to, jump on the issue. I know at the moment with FIFA, with I think I'm right in saying with Iran having qualified for the World Cup and the current US-Iran dynamic. Yes, all the athletes, the players can go, but where are they going to train? And what's going to happen for the fans and visa? Yeah, not simple.
No. So then again, the politics will play a big part there as well.
The politics plays a big part, I think, in the hosting of any event now. I mean, there are very few nations that can host an event where the politics is not one way or the other, whether it's politics driven by the host, or let's go back recently now to the Olympic Games in Tokyo. Japan per se was, should we say, a pretty neutral, political host. It was made very clear to the IOC that if the IOC didn't sanction Russia, a lot of nations would be forced to consider a boycott because they would not compete against Russia. So even if your host is stable, to my point earlier about the weaponization of sport, whether nations can or can't go, it's very, very complicated trying to thread that needle. Back to just your earlier point about Los Angeles, how will they do? 84, and they were my first summer games. In some ways, they certainly reinvented the business model, and they showed that you could successfully stage an Olympic Games, great Olympic Games, without bankrupting the city, because they had all the facilities, pretty much ready. And Peter Uberoff, the president of the committee, was a legendary business leader and marketeer. I think 2028 Los Angeles will also bring a lot of new thinking to the whole presentation. I think the merger of sport and entertainment and how the whole experience for the fan inside the stadium, the whole relationship to music, production, where something which in volleyball we've been sort of probably at the forefront of creating that sort of atmosphere. I think LA will do a great job from a sort of taking sports presentation to a new level.
Mm. So, I mean, we talked about you have been 5 decades in the sports industry now, and from the Cold War Olympics to AI enhanced fans engagement, a lot have happened in these years. I know you are mentioning some predictions in the end of the book, and again, like don't want to spoil them, but what are some predictions that you think there is in the sports industry going forward?
Well, I take everybody on this 50-year journey, the personal journey through the industry, and I sort of get to the end of the book and say, right, I hope you enjoyed the journey. What does the next 50 years have to offer? And proceed to make a number of, I suppose, what many would say were fairly outrageous predictions until you say 50 years? Nah, frankly, quite a lot of it could come within the next 10 years. And, the predictions range from the governance of sport and whether the current model of international federations that have stayed the test of time, for over a century, is that current structure and model sustainable? If you look at how sport is now viewed as an asset class from an investment perspective, the revival of private equity, of sovereign wealth funds, the threat of more athlete breakaways, what is the future governance of sport going to look like? And I make one somewhat provocative prediction, that is that NFL will make a hostile takeover of world rugby. Because if you were a company, you would do it tomorrow. There's no question. From a corporate perspective, NFL wants to step out onto the world stage. World Rugby could offer them that tomorrow. They're taking flag football into the Olympics. It's not that NFL replaces rugby. It would be a merger. So you look at it from governance, you go through to the venue experience. I mean, another, forecast that the World Cup final in football will be staged in 5 stadiums on 5 continents at the same time. And you go, what's happening here? One stadium will have live humans. 4 stadia will have live avatars. You will not be able to tell the difference. Not with glasses or whatever. You will be in the stadium. And if you go and look at, what ABBA is now doing with their new concert, that's already there. And then you just think how that technology is going to evolve within a decade. So for the opportunity for everybody to have a greater community experience. My son doesn't like watching football at home. He wants to go to the pub and there watch it with, 50 other people. And that's, those types of experiences. And then you go on to, drugs and doping. What do you do when you're not wearing the technology on the outside, but it's implanted in the body? So the pace of change, like it is in any industry, a lot of it pioneered by AI, is substantial. And the challenge will be that, sport needs to be careful that it doesn't lose its soul.
I think that's the tricky one, right? Because now, for example, we have you heard about the enhanced games?
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, for those who don't know that, for example, then they allow all time of PD performance enhancing drugs, PEDs, and then you compete. But then again, talking about soul, talking about the integrity of the games, do you see that there is a risk with also, the AI coming in? You mentioned avatars. Is there a risk that the integrity and soul of the Olympic Games might fade?
If you don't understand what it is that makes it special, what it is that makes it magical, what it is that makes it human, then then there are risks. So, take, technology. Technology has always been helping and aiding the athlete. Take my sport of skiing. You can't compare the way that ski equipment has evolved over the last 50 years. In principle, that's a good thing. What happens when you take a tennis racket and with all of the latest AI cloud technology, the strings on the racket change, not between sets, between games, between points, but during the point, depending on how the player responds, and the camera is looking at the speed of the ball. At what stage is that technology going too far? And if you want, it's a human along for the ride. Now, for Formula One, it is exactly that. It is a technology human marriage. But is that acceptable in other sports?
You have the
To
example
what
of,
ex-
sorry, you have the example of swimming, for example. They had this suit that they took over, and
Exactly.
they broke all the records, and then they banned it afterwards.
Yeah, because they said we're losing something. And, I think World Athletics has been struggling with the Nike, was it Vaporfly shoe, which, evolves as you're running. Um, you go to judging, everybody wants judging to be fair. And you look in with technologies like Hawkeye in tennis, whether the ball's in or out, I think everybody now has pretty much accepted that as being good for the sport. If you look at diving, how can the human eye really judge, diving and the speed with which the diver is going at compared to, say, AI technology? But at what stage, if all judging and refereeing becomes AI, are you going to lose something again that is key to sport, which is, the debate after the football match of, you know, the ref stole it or whatever. So I don't propose in the final chapter of the book to give a lot of answers. I do try to put forward a lot of observations, at times very provocative, for people to say, hadn't thought about that. Yeah, that's that's not straightforward. And then let the debate begin.
Definitely. It's a tough one for sure. As you said, there are levels to this. But a real thought experimenter that you leave the reader with. I like that a lot. I would like to discuss a little bit about sustainability and the games, and from different aspects. So I lived in Greece for a couple of years in Athens, and a lot of white elephants after 2004. And obviously, everyone knows that Greece went into a recession and had economic difficulties for a couple of years. That's just one example. So how, as the games develop, how can we ensure that it's more sustainable in terms of the venues, in terms of the economy, and also from an environmental standpoint?
Well, I think, like any business, and sport is just but one business here, the public, and in particular the younger generation, are demanding that there is a proper sustainability plan, whether it's economic, which can lead to legacy, whether it is best practice in terms of sustainability initiatives. And clearly, sport, because it's something that everybody cares about so much, because it's something which has such a profile, can play a leading role. If I was to look at the Athens example, and there's been an awful lot written and everything about that, there were probably three problems specifically with Athens. One, they wasted the first 3.5 years of their planning and organization. So the final operation became a massive scramble, and they didn't fully think through the legacy plans. Two, I don't know how many white elephants there were. There were some, no question. And I remember at the time battling with the Greeks to say, don't build it, make it temporary. Greece doesn't play baseball, so we don't need a baseball stadium. But you would have one or other politician, for whatever particular reason he may have in mind, maybe even his pension fund, would insist on building a baseball stadium. And the IOC knew full well that the IOC is going to be the one who'll be criticized for allowing it to happen. So I think there's been an increasing profile from the IOC standpoint to say, be much firmer in its advice. But if the politicians decide, no, we're going to do it, and you had a good example with Milano Cortina coming up in the bobsleigh, where the IOC was very vocal against the renovation of the bobsleigh run and wanted the organizing committee to stage the bobsleigh in either Austria or some other country that had a run built, because they said it's a waste of money building it and the IOC will be criticized. To the Italians' credit, they've succeeded in renovating it and delivering it just on time. And they are very proud of having done it. If you then move to the broader agenda of sustainability and how the sports event, the Olympic Games, or the FIFA World Cup are staged in a best practice sustainability model, I think the sports bodies are increasingly trying to do that. But equally, resources are limited, and I think you probably need to be very focused as to what is your mission. The IOC a few years ago launched something known as the Olympic Forest Network, which was planting forests around the world. Yeah, it's very noble, but nothing to do with sport, and is a drop in the ocean. And I think that the IOC probably would be better served sticking very focused on what your core mission, which is the sport, and not let yourself get distracted into other areas.
So the Milano Cortina one, I know I'm from Sweden, and I know that Sweden were bidding on that games, and I've talked about it on the podcast as well, and it stings a little bit to those who wanted it to be in Sweden that the Winter Games was in Milano Cortina, which is more of a summer destination, maybe a winter one. And you mentioned also that they didn't have all the venues. So how do you look at that? I don't know how involved you were in that bidding, but when you're having a country with more of a winter climate, we also have most of the venues versus a country that might have more of a summer climate and less venues.
Um, well, one, I was not involved at all in that whole bidding process, and but I was observing it. Uh, I would be cautious at saying Italy is a summer nation. You go to northern Italy, it's the winter sport and the Alps is a very important part of the culture. Um, I think there were some challenges, if I recall correctly, with the Stockholm bid in terms of some of the undertakings and guarantees. And I think maybe the lawyers were trying to get everything too perfect. And I would argue that you cannot have one size fits all. The Italians came in and promised everything. And the government said, oh, we'll do this. Don't worry. We'll promise. No problem at all. Have they done it all? No. And you will have some countries who will make guarantees. And then once it's awarded, yeah, we'll see how we get there. You can have other countries where, say, the winter sports is very much part of the DNA, or not just from winter sports, the nature of the country is if we're awarded, we will step out and we will do whatever it takes. I still believe that the Lillehammer Winter Olympics was one of, if not the greatest Winter Olympic Games ever. There's no way Lillehammer would be awarded the Games today with all of the guarantees and checks and balances that are required. It would be too difficult. So I think, it's not easy for the IOC if they're running a contest where if you want everybody has to be treated fairly, and you say, right, I need these guarantees, and one country delivers the guarantees and another country doesn't. But you know full well that other country, if they were awarded, it probably wouldn't be a problem in terms of delivery. So I think going forward, and I know the IOC and President Coventry is looking at the whole bidding process and how it's managed, but I think there needs to be a little bit more discretion in understanding the dynamic of what it means to go to one country. You can, if you're going to go to China, the Chinese government will do everything necessary to operationally deliver and deliver on multiple fronts. You could go to one of their big neighbors who is very focused and keen on trying to get the games at the moment. And you know full well their track record doesn't matter what the government guarantees and promises. You are taking an almighty risk because of just the track record and the nature and culture of the country. And, I think in the end, I think Milano Cortina, from a television perspective, will look spectacular. On the ground, because it is so spread out, not simple. But then again, Stockholm's bid, also required, I think, everybody to get on a plane to fly to the Alpine venues. So I hope, that I'm a great believer in the Scandinavian winter sport dynamic, and I seriously hope that Sweden will eventually succeed in bidding and winning the right to host the Olympic Games.
Let's see. I like to ask for some advice for young people, and a lot of you see that on a lot of experience. So if someone wants to work in the sports industry, maybe in sports marketing like yourself, What is some advice that you have for them?
Um, I mean, to get out with as much work experience as possible, whether that is volunteering to work, you know, at the big events, at the World Championship events, at the national events, um, but to understand or just working on the operational delivery and complexity, building up, so work experience on the CV. If you're looking at the sports management side, uh, working in any one of the agencies, whether it's PR, digital marketing, um, and gaining the perspective and experience. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of degrees out there with specific sports marketing focus, which are good degrees, but nothing is going to beat the personal experience, work experience. And I think quite a lot of the federations and clubs, they have good sort of internship programs. And I think that's some of the best way to start.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer of internships as well. And I don't think that they are wasted because either you learn that you like something or you learn that you don't like something. So then you can exclude that from your job searches going forward.
Absolutely.
Something that you wrote in the book, a quote that I pulled, I think is also pretty good advice, is don't call your boss with problems, call them with solutions.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the back of the book, I do a list of the 10 key business lessons. And, if you're the boss, you know, you clearly, your direct reports and said, look, here's a problem, but this is how I think we should deal with it, is already showing, leadership and innovation. Sometimes it's too complicated, but to be always going and saying, here's a problem, what do I do? If you're the boss, there's not always enough hours in the day to spend all of your time, solving the problems, which if, the employee took a few minutes to think about it, and say, well, maybe there's a way through this. In the same way as how you manage your communications, one of the other, key business lessons I sort of try and uh, emphasize, particularly in negotiations, is more often than not, you gain a lot more by letting the other side speak first. Uh, Silence is a very powerful tool in negotiations and discussions. Yes, you've got to set forth what your objectives and everything are, but often I've seen people talk way too much and as a result dig themselves into a hole. And there's one classic example, that I tell in the book of how the biggest agency at the time successfully fired themselves by talking them, into a hole.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting one because I've heard someone else say like the opposite, that you should speak first because then you set the bar of where you want to be. But I mean, if you flip that on its head and you let the other side speak, maybe they put it way higher than you expected. But I mean, you can never guarantee anything. But I think it's the silence is power. I really agree on that. But then,
Yeah,
who?
each negotiation, each discussion, obviously has a particular dynamic. And, if you're going in cold and there's not been any discussion of where are you coming from and what are you trying to achieve, then you probably have to map some of that out.
Hmm.
But on the assumption that it's been mapped out, then, okay, what do you think of it? How do you see it? And then you get to hear, where the issues are, where new opportunities that you perhaps hadn't thought about, what is really causing concern. Um, the power of listening is underappreciated.
Do you think that you had a natural talent for negotiating? Because I read in the book as well that you started negotiating already in school and excusing yourself from activities so that you could train.
Um, no, I honestly I don't. Um, and you know, people turn around now and say, "Look, you've written 3 books and you're a natural writer." Well, my school teachers certainly wouldn't agree with that. I think I barely scraped English O level. I don't know how it came about. I think it's an experience and willing to learn from a practical standpoint, being a very good observer. One of the gentlemen who had the greatest influence on my career was President Samaranch, and he would say, "We're going over in that direction," and point, what the objective is in the direction, and then set off in the opposite direction. I said, "But hang on, excuse me, I thought you said we're going over there. Why are we going backwards?" And he would look and touch his nose and say, "Watch." And very slowly, we would circle around, maybe a slightly more circuitous route, but always arrived at the destination because you were dealing in a multi dynamic political environment. His successor, Jacques Rogge, who was a very well meaning, sincere surgeon, would say, "Where are we going?" Would point in the direction and would go straight there and never arrived. That I'm not sure you can ever learn at school or at university. You can only learn that by watching very experienced business or political leaders deal with very complex issues. And, hopefully some of that learning eventually you can incorporate into how you manage. And I mean, I have 3 grown-up children, and they sort of grew up at the dinner table, so hearing about me talking about negotiations and discussions, and I think probably we're fortunate to get to the masterclass earlier on, where when they're negotiating now, the people who, "Where did you learn this stuff?" And not sure it was at university.
Yeah. So what lies ahead for Michael Payne right now? You have your own consultancy. Is there anything else on your radar?
Well, I was asked at the beginning of the year to take over the chairmanship of Volleyball World, which is the commercial arm of volleyball, where it oversees all of the events, TV, media, sponsorship. So I'm chairman of that. I continue to advise some of the big partners. I mean, most notably Alibaba and their whole strategy. And they are at the forefront of bringing AI into sport. I forget how many AI related programs we're now running in Torino, in Milan, Cortina. I also last year put together the technology deal for FIFA with Lenovo, which again will bring a lot of new thinking and technology to the World Cup next year. So in between writing the book, I find the odd project to keep me entertained.
You're keeping busy for sure.
You get bored otherwise. I mean, it's even if I'm technically past the age of retirement, I'd be bored stiff just sitting at home doing nothing. So, and if you can contribute, if you can make a difference, uh, and it's fun, then why not?
For sure. So we've talked a lot about the book. I have read almost all of it, and it's fantastic. We have talked about it today. So if someone wants to buy one, because now it's officially released as well, where can they buy it?
I think probably the simplest is probably Amazon because they've sort of managed a very good distribution structure. My publisher has a website, very simple, fast tracks dark deals, and you can order directly from there. And I think some of the big bookshops are all now starting to stock it. But on the basis that your listeners are probably from around the world, I would check first with Amazon. They have it both as a digital book, and but I'm old school, and I prefer the hard copy. And as you will have seen with your copy you've just received, it's quite chunky. It's also got a lot of interesting photographs showing the different personalities, the different characters who built the industry. I think when people get the book initially, they're probably a little bit intimidated and say, "Oof, this looks a little bit heavy." And then I'm getting various messages, either along the lines of, "I can't put it down. It's a spy thriller," or "I am, forgive me, pissing myself with laughter. It was not what I was expecting." Um, and so, as much as there is insights and interesting history, I hope it's also fun to read.
For sure. I can agree to that for sure. I like to end on a networking question, and I know you have a big one. So, who from your network do you think would be a good guest on this show?
Probably the next president of the IOC, Kirsty Coventry. Oh, sorry, the new president of the IOC, Kirsty Coventry. The president of World Volleyball, Fabio Azevedo, who I think is very much if I would say, the new school of federation leaders, and how he is driving volleyball forward, in particular at the grassroots and foundational level. Then, you go to people like George Pine from Bruin Capital, who's at the forefront of private equity investment in sport and backing a lot of the new digital companies. He, for a period of time, bought Two Circles, which was the sports data company. Or no harm also in getting athletes talking about their perspective and experience, even if it's recently retired. You've got there's one or two IOC member athletes who are chairing the working groups on AI and sports, and so you've got I mean, the good thing is you've got a lot of choice, a lot of potential out there.
Yeah, definitely. And great suggestion. So, really appreciate that. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Sports Management Podcast.
Marcus, it's great to be with you again, and thank you for all you're doing in helping the world understand the business of sport.
Thank you so much.